Hello and welcome to Module 2 in Urban Planning Law. Today we're going to start looking more intensely at different parts of the Planning Act, and we're going to start with state planning powers. And the question I'm setting for you in this module is the state the controlling hand? Should it be the controlling hand? Should we instead have more autonomy, devolution to local government? Perhaps we have the balance about right. Let's have a look through the instruments and powers and think about that question again. Okay, the themes and topics for Module 2. In this topic, Topic 1, I'm going to give you a framework overview of the various state planning powers and instruments. We're going to have a look at how they've changed the role of the state over time. We're going to visit this question of the controlling hand. Do we want a lot of state power or a lot of local government power in planning issues? And in this topic, we're going to have a little bit of a focus on the State Planning Policy 2016. In Topic 2, in this module, we're going to look at the South East Queensland Regional Plan, which is a really interesting area, I believe. And then in Topic 3, we're going to have a look at some case law on managing urban growth and change to see how all these dramas in these planning intentions work out in the real world of planning conflicts. So, moving into my framework overview of state planning instruments and state planning powers, you'll see that we have had some changes over time. Sorry if that's a little bit small. Under the original IPA in 1997, it was a really radical overhaul of the legislation, as I gave you some awareness of in Module 1. It was very much moving towards a performance-based planning system. Planning schemes were to become comprehensive, dealing with land use, infrastructure, development, natural features. But one thing that wasn't included was a degree of uniformity between planning schemes. In fact, some people might say local governments were really landed in it without a very clear sense of direction how to formulate or how to change their planning schemes. So there was really quite a lot of autonomy, and that's why I've put the signposts going in all directions there. When we come to the SPA in 2007, you'll see that there's a really concerted effort to produce more consistency, more sense of direction, more uniformity, partly to help local governments to make the job a slightly easier one for them, but also because we had some really pressing planning issues that were foremost in everybody's mind, particularly population growth. So that we needed a clearer sense of direction, and very much a part of the SPA was this greater uniformity, hierarchy, and to get that they needed more active state leadership. So you'll see that state planning instruments come to the fore in the SPA, and they appear to give the state a lot of power. Okay, there was a bit of a backlash against that from around about 2013, suggesting that local governments would actually prefer or enjoy a little bit more autonomy. I'm not sure to what extent they're really going to get that in the 2015 Act, and that's why I've left a question mark up there, as you can see. But we certainly do have a degree of streamlining of the state planning instruments and a little bit more local autonomy, you could say. Okay, now the other thing to note about the state planning instruments that we have on the SPA, I'm going to look at the SPA first. These are our existing state planning instruments. There are 4, and they're arranged in a hierarchy. So this is all part of that centralising, uniformity, getting a clear sense of direction. At the top of that hierarchy arrive the state planning regulatory provisions. Second down, we have state planning policies. We only have one. Regional plans, and I've told you already, we're going to look at the South East Queensland Regional Plan in some detail. And then we have the standard planning scheme provisions. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview of each of these instruments. Perhaps before I go any further, and I will explain this further down the track as well, in the Planning Act, when that comes into force next year, you will see that that ladder reduce. We're moving towards just a state planning policy and regional plans at this level. However, information requirements that are currently in the state planning regulatory provisions and the standard planning scheme provisions are not going to disappear. they're going to shift over into the planning regulation, which is something we may talk a little bit more about further down the track. So don't worry, it's worth being aware of what each of these instruments are, and they will carry you through into the future, but we should note some changes. Okay, let's look firstly at that top level, the state planning regulatory provisions. Now, until the Planning Act, and currently at the moment, you'll find that these are the topmost planning instrument. They may be made by the planning minister or by other ministers in cooperation with the planning minister, so could conceivably cover a whole range of planning related activities. To advance regional planning, to set adopted infrastructure charges, or to protect against adverse impacts, which is never wholly defined. So there is some leeway there. Okay, the most important things to note are the two last bullet points. The state planning regulatory provisions take priority over every other planning instrument made under the SPA or even under another act, which is quite interesting, very powerful tool. Raises the status of planning in the state, doesn't it? The other important thing to note is that these state planning regulatory provisions are regulatory in nature and effect, and they may include absolute prohibitions. Now, I think this is a really interesting point to make, that when we see something that's I describe as regulatory in nature, I'm looking for a clear sense of what you can do and what you can't do. Lawyers like that sort of thing, you know, obligation, prohibition, penalty if you go against the prohibition. When we look at planning instruments, so much of it is, I shouldn't say this, wishy-washy perhaps, but you know, more discussive, more goal-oriented, more open-ended and fluid in the way it's written. So that's the kind of distinction I'm drawing. And just to give you an example, here's a section from the South East Queensland Regional Plan Regulatory Provisions, where it says, a subdivision of land in the regional landscape and rural production area is contrary to these state planning regulatory provisions and may not occur, you could read must not if you like, if identified in column 2 of table 3A, which effectively says the subdivision, if the subdivision results in lots of less than 100 hectares. So there's a clear sense of prohibition and a clear division between what you can do and what you can't do in a regulatory provision. So the law students should be quite comfortable with that. Okay, and you planning students will get comfortable with it too. Okay, let's move on. The second instrument in the ladder, in the hierarchy, is our state planning policies. Originally provision for as many state planning policies as were made. Now we've moved towards a single state planning policy. Now, a state planning policy will state policy on a matter of state interest. You can see the references to the SPA and the Planning Act there. It will have effect throughout the state unless it states otherwise. It must relate solely to matters of state interest. So we're going to have a look at that definition next. It's important to note that local governments must interpret and integrate the state planning policy into their local planning schemes. So this is how these state planning instruments work. Everything should be, shall we say, downloaded into your local government scheme, not word for word, but by means of a reinterpretation, an application to the local context. So that's what these state planning instruments attempt to do. They set the framework, which will then be interpreted and applied at a more local level. Okay, under the Planning Act, state planning policies will become the paramount planning instrument because we will see the end of the state regulatory provisions. So that's a little bit of introduction to state planning policy. I said we should define state interest to know the scope of what a state planning policy is all about. Okay, have a look at this this definition. It's an interest that in the minister's opinion affects an economic or environmental interest of the state or part of it. That's pretty broad, isn't it? I suppose it's consistent with that overall purpose of advancing ecological sustainability. Or an interest in ensuring there is an efficient, effective and accountable planning and development assessment system. So even broader when you include that definition as well. Also linked to the Act's purpose, that was all included up there in that notion of what advancing the Act's purpose is about. I've put in blue there the rewording in the Planning Act where it says, or an interest in ensure that affects advancing the Act's purpose. It's a slight refinement. You can see that it's the mission of the Planning Act to trim those terminology, trim the words down. So I think they've done that quite nicely there. Okay, so I've left the question mark there because I want you to think that's actually that's it. And again, it's in the minister's opinion, so there's a degree of discretion, but that's a large scope for what could be a state interest if we're thinking about that controlling hand issue. Okay, let's have a look now at the 2016 variant of the single state planning policy. This is a single integrated comprehensive state planning policy for Queensland, comprising a statement of guiding principles in Part C and a statement and explanation of state interests as they relate to plan making in Part D. So this is connecting with the idea of we will define and expand on state interests. We're going to have a look at the state interests in Part D first. Okay, the state interests described and covered in Part D relate to livable communities and housing, economic growth, environment and heritage, safety and resilience to hazards, and infrastructure. Now, for the last 4 of those bullet points, I can relate them quite easily to degrees of state funding, state legislation, state powers. The top one is perhaps a little bit more borderline. Of course, we know that the state is interested in land use and planning generally. But, you know, we've often thought of that as the business of local government. So it's interesting that that's you know, the state is encompassing all these things within its state interests interpretation. Okay, let's just explore that tiny bit more because I am interested in what the state policy has to say about livable communities and housing, because of course that's core business for planners and for local government planning schemes as well. Okay, why are livability and housing state interests? Well, here's the explanation that's given in the state planning policy. The livability of communities is of fundamental concern to all levels of government, as it directly influences our quality of life and well-being. So I think that's an interesting way of putting it, and I guess that's harking back to the ideas in ecological sustainability about quality of life, community well-being. So they've put it rather nicely there. A little bit more specifically, and perhaps less surprisingly, the state's interest in housing supply and diversity is to ensure sufficient land and housing stock is available in appropriate locations to support development, resource and infrastructure related projects and to meet the diverse needs of different sections of the community. So we've got a little bit of a reference now to infrastructure, transport and economic development. So housing's quite closely connected, I guess you won't be surprised, to the idea of promoting the land use development industry. Confirmed, I think, in that 3rd bullet point. Effective planning policies for diverse, that's an interesting word to include there, residential development, no, not affordable, but included within that diverse. Effective planning policies for diverse residential development will benefit the Queensland economy by supporting the development and construction industries and the livability of our communities. So you can see it's reaching out in a big way, a big agenda to have a claim and to have an interest in land use planning in Queensland at the state level. Okay, now what's the state hoping to achieve? You'll have to excuse me. How to meet livability requirements. Okay, I've told you already that the idea with these state and regional planning instruments is that they will be incorporated, translated into your local planning scheme. So the way to do this is to provide for quality urban design that reflects and enhances local character and community identity. Well, I hope all good planners are going to do that for us. Isn't that your mission, I would hope? Okay, you should also be providing attractive and accessible natural environments and public open space by, let's see, facilitating vibrant places and spaces, diverse communities and good neighbourhood planning and centres design that meets lifestyle requirements or ambitions, facilitating the provision of pedestrian, cycling and public transport infrastructure and connectivity between those networks, and planning for cost-effective, well-located and efficient use of community facilities and utilities. So nothing too surprising there. It's really a statement of what best practice in planning should be. So on the one hand, I'm glad to see that. On the other hand, I feel, is this a little bit superfluous? Or maybe you planners like it. It gives you a sort of Bible to resort to. Okay, hold on a minute. Next issue I want to address with you is we've seen the scope and the scale of the state planning policy and how it is pretty much up there at the top level. It's not too specific. It has to be interpreted and manipulated and handled in the local government planning scheme. What happens if you're attempting to draft your local government planning scheme and you feel a sense of conflict between different planning, the different state interests defined in the planning policy? For example, we know we're promoting livable communities, we know we're promoting resilience to hazards, but we're also promoting economic growth, seems to fit well with housing. What about environment and heritage? What if that sort of has a conflict with the kind of infrastructure that needs to be built, or where we're citing our livable communities? So as always, this is such a big question for planning, and I guess this is where some of the planning law especially comes head on into planning, is where we see the conflict between different principles and ambitions and goals. Okay, let's see if the state planning policy gives us any help here. The state planning policy does not prioritise any one state interest over any other. Not too helpful on it by itself. So the state interests need to be read in their entirety. Not sure if that's particularly helpful either. The SPP is more than a set of individual policies on discrete matters of state interest. Okay, I would be struggling. Maybe you planners can do better than me to really get assistance from that in resolving a potential conflict, but maybe you can do better than me. And then we have, this is, I think, quite significant. Regional and local context must always be considered when integrating state interests. So you can see, even though we have at the top of the ladder a state planning policy, supposedly the controlling hand, what it all really comes down to is how you apply this in the regional and local context. So perhaps we've got a nice bit of autonomy, or delegation, devolution coming back into play there, because that really seems to be the the most persuasive of these principles for resolving conflict. There's also mentioned recourse to the guiding principles in Part C, which carry equal weight with state interests expressed in Part D, the one I've just shown you, and must be considered by local government as part of the integration of state interests. Well, maybe this is a solution. I think not. Here are the guiding principles. Your planning must be outcome focused, of course. It must be integrated, of course, but that's the problem. How? It must be efficient. It must seek for positive outcomes, positive planning, please, in positive Queensland, and it must be accountable. Noble ideals, I'm just not sure that they fix the problem of selecting between conflicts for me. I think the one that does it for me would be interpretation in the local and regional context, and that's why all that I'm telling you about this week is important, but so too are local government planning schemes. So having said that, having given you that proviso, maybe we think that state planning policy is just about right. It's got a good balance between the state declaring its interest, keeping it open-ended, exercising quite a bit, a large measure of discretion, but it does delegate and devolve back to the local communities to pad it out, fill it out. Okay, have a think about that. Okay, just two more planning instruments I want to introduce you to in this topic. Firstly, regional plans. We'll be looking at this in a lot more detail in topic 2, but I'll just run through some basic points for you. A regional plan is a plan setting out integrated, of course, planning and development assessment policies about matters of state interest again, for particular regions, unlike generally the state planning policy. It includes desired regional outcomes, policies and actions to achieve desired regional outcomes, and a desired future spatial structure. We're going to look at this more in topic 2. It identifies the desired future spatial structure of the region, including a future regional land use pattern. I'll give you an example shortly. And the regional plan, again, once again, must be reflected in a local planning scheme. So your relevant sections of both pieces of legislation are down there. Once again, the idea is that it will be interpreted into your local government planning scheme. Okay, we'll leave off to Module 2 for more about regional plans. What about the standard planning scheme provisions? And actually, I'm going to talk more about this in Module 3. But again, I'll just introduce you to the topic. These are another state planning instrument. Again, you could say regulatory in nature, and perhaps that's why they're being shifted out of this hierarchy from this place under the Planning Act. But they're not all obligatory. There's guidance material in there and policy-related material, quite a lot of it in the QPPs, or the Standard Planning Scheme. The QPP stands for Queensland Planning Provisions. Okay, so what the Standard Planning Scheme provisions really attempt to do is to provide a consistent format for local planning schemes. If you remember, I said that when the IPA came in, actually local governments were given very little help, very little sense of direction about how their planning scheme should be drafted. This was going to do half of that job for you by standardising terminology, by using a standard suite of zones. Some of that's a little bit of that's gone, a little bit of that's going to move into a planning regulation under the Planning Act next year, and it will actually become optional rather than mandatory, although some of it's already optional. So we'll talk more about that in Module 3. Anyway, other things that the Standard Planning Scheme provisions do, they provide rules for dealing with conflicts within a planning scheme, which we have used in the past, generally found helpful, but there are other rules in the SPA as well, so it can be a little bit confusing at times. There's some standardised content, not just format, but content about what you might want to achieve in each zone, but plenty of room for filling in by local governments. May include prohibited development. Local governments, this is an important one, must ensure their new or revised planning schemes are consistent with the Standard Planning Scheme provisions. So when we look at the Gold Coast Planning Scheme and the Brisbane City Planning Scheme in Module 3, you'll see a very similar format because they're based on the SPPs. At the current time under the SPA, applying the SPPs was compulsory over time. They will no longer continue as a compulsory requirement upon local governments. Okay, we'll look at them again when we look at local government schemes, their content and format. Right, and this concludes my summary of the overview of the state planning instruments. Oops, am I going the wrong way? Oh yes, just 2 more slides, sorry. First one, changes pending in the Planning Act. I've already foreshadowed most of these. The state planning regulatory provisions and standard planning scheme provisions will be discontinued. The same or modified provisions of both will now be incorporated into the planning regulation, which is still in draft, so wait and see a little bit. The state planning policy will become the paramount state planning instrument at the top of the ladder. The standard planning scheme provisions, or sometimes called the Queensland Planning Provisions, will become optional at this stage. Last slide. Just something for you to go away and have a think about, perhaps before the next module or when you're completing all the reading, although I hope you've done most of the reading already. State planning powers. You've looked at the overview. Are we seeing that there's too much, too little, or just about right? Thank you.